We talked about the heart. Now we're going to go into how the heart works and know what the cardiac cycle is. That'll be the major objective. Again, the idea of the cardiac cycle is that it is just a heartbeat, right? So simply put, the cardiac cycle is the repeating pattern of both contraction and relaxation of the heart that allows blood to be pumped into the systemic circulation to deliver oxygen and nutrients. The contraction phase is defined as systole, and the relaxation phase is defined as diastole. This is in the heart. Of course, in the vessels, you're probably familiar with the blood pressure terms, systolic and diastolic blood pressure. That's the same, essentially, contraction of blood being pumped through the arteries, and then relaxation when there's no blood being pumped through the arteries. So in general, when they are used alone, they refer to the ventricles because the ventricles are what is doing the blood pumping to the body, and I will use this for the most part, but it's important to remember that both the left and right atria are also contracting and relaxing throughout this process as well. However, it is important to note that atrial contraction occurs during ventricular relaxation or diastole, and then of course the converse, atrial relaxation occurs while the ventricles are doing their contracting. So the heart as a four-chamber system has a two-step pumping system. The first is that the right and left atria contract together, right? And this makes sense because in the last module we talked about these intercalating discs creating these functional syncytiums, and we're able to then create a wave of contraction from both the right and left atria. It's important to note that there is specialized cells that essentially divide the atria and the ventricles so that we don't have any depolarization spread from the atria to the ventricles and cause a contraction that way. We'll talk more about how that works, but we have a very specific pathway that happens. So they are completely separate. So the atria contract. The purpose of the contraction of the atria is to fully empty blood into the ventricles. Right? Shortly after atrial contraction, then the ventricles will contract, and they will then deliver blood to both the lungs and the systemic circulation. So at rest, the ventricular contraction is quite strong. It ejects about 2/3 of the blood, leaving about 1/3 of blood in the ventricles. This 2/3 is what's known as the ejection fraction, and is a great clinical measure for how well the heart is working. If it decreases at rest and isn't producing this much, then that gives us an idea that there's some type of dysfunction going on in the heart. The ventricles fill with blood and then contract again. So for example, I have an idea of here's what the cardiac cycle looks like as far as diastole and systole. Again, diastole and systole, when used alone here, specifically is referring to ventricles relaxing and contracting. Right? So if we have an average heart rate of about 75 beats per minute, which is normal for a young, healthy male or female, the whole cardiac cycle then takes less than a second, right? 60 seconds divided by 75 beats per minute gives us about 0.8 of a second. We spend more time spent in diastole, about half a second in diastole to allow blood filling of the ventricles, and then a shorter amount of time, about 0.3 of a second, spent in the systolic contraction in order to pump that blood. During heavy exercise, if we then increase our heart rate, there is a reduced time spent in both diastole and systole, but a greater reduction in the duration of diastole. And we can see that here. So here is rest, 75 beats per minute. Systole, about 1/3 of a second. Diastole, this relaxation or filling time, is about half a second. In heavy exercise, we can only shorten the contraction phase a certain amount of time, and therefore we lose a lot more time in our diastole. So let's look at the pressure changes and how we move blood flow between the atria and ventricles. Okay? So during the cardiac cycle, pressure in the heart will rise and fall based on relaxation and contraction of the muscles. When the atria are relaxed, blood flows into them from the venous circulation, returning blood back into the heart, primarily into the right atria if it's coming from systemic, and in the left atrium if it is coming from the pulmonary system to return blood flow back that is now oxygenated. As the atria fill, the pressure inside is going to gradually increase. And so we can see that here. We'll see a gradual increase in that. And indeed, about 70% of blood entering the atria flows directly to the ventricles before the atria contract. So in other words, what we do is we just have the atrioventricular valves are, for the most part, open and allows blood flow to go straight into them. When the atria contract, the ventricular pressure increases slightly. That ventricular pressure, you can see here, is the atrial contraction. We see that it increases slightly because you're just pushing more blood down. This forces the remaining atrial blood, about 30%, into the ventricles. So at the end of the atrial contraction, the atria has zero blood in it, pumps it all out. Pressure is ventricles is low while it is filling. Again, it's coming from the circulation. As the atrial contracts, then of course the ventricular pressure is going to go up. It's going to be more full with blood. And so the ventricle contracts, the ventricular pressure is going to rise very, very rapidly. It's going to generate a lot of muscle force and a very rapid motion, which closes the AV valve. That force again closes so we don't get any backflow into the atria, and therefore when pressure will continue to build. It will build and build and build as the muscle tries to contract and try to force blood out, but at this point both the AV valve and the semilunar valves are both closed at this point, generating lots of force as it's able to overcome the pressure of the valves. Then we see the aortic and pulmonary valves are going to open, and when they do, then you'll see the pressure is rapidly dropped as blood is ejected from the heart. So again, just to review, contraction phase is systole, blood pumped out of the chamber. It can be either in the atrium or in the ventricles, but usually we're referring to the ventricles. Diastole is the relaxation phase, and the job of this is to fill the chamber. So if we think about then how is the cardiac cycle regulated? So one thing that I have yet to mention is that cardiac myocytes are very specialized in that they have what is called an autorhythmicity, or autorhythmicity, right? This is just that the idea that the heart cells are going to automatically have a rate of contraction on their own that is completely just determined by that cell type. Again, this is in stark contrast to skeletal muscle because we have alpha motor neurons that cause the contractions, but here these contractions actually happen on a regular cycled basis. So every certain number of seconds or a given amount of time, then that muscle cell, this cardiac myocyte, will contract, and remember, as one contracts, then it will spread throughout, in this case the atria, and will spread throughout all the ones next to it. So we have three different main makeups that we can use that talk about the autorhythmicity. Each of them have a different rate, right? So we have a specialized place called the SA node. The SA node is what is known and defined as the pacemaker of cardiac muscle contraction. It's a specialized zone in the right atria that has the highest rate of autorhythmicity. So it is going to hopefully drive the muscle the contraction of the heart. It's going to contract more times per minute than any other tissue cells. So that means it's then going to be the pacemaker, because once it contracts, then the rest of the heart will contract. So the goal of it is then to initiate atrial contraction in systole. So one of the next things that we talked about, we mentioned this earlier, that there is a barrier between the atria and the ventricles, right? And so we can't get any of this spreading of the contraction from atria into ventricles, and so we need a way to pass that down. So what we have is a specialized pathway that ultimately contains what's known as the atrioventricular node. This node is important because it delays the impulse for about 1/10 of a second. Right? The importance of this is that it allows the atria to force all the blood into the ventricles and allows them to fill completely. So the point of that delay is to allow them to fill completely. We then have what's known as the Purkinje fibers, which rapidly spread impulses to contract the ventricles in a synchronized manner, and we'll see that in this next figure, and I'll kind of explain how those work. So if we look at the heart here, again, here's our right atria, right ventricle, left atria, left ventricle. Our SA node, again, is here in the right, at the top of the right atrium. When it automatically contracts, it then spreads the wave of contraction to both the atria and causing them to contract. They then force blood into the ventricles. The spread of depolarization will sit here in the AV node for about 1/10 of a second and pause. Again, that pause is important because it allows us to fill the ventricles with blood. Then we'll allow that signal to come all the way down to the bottom of the ventricles through what is known as bundle branches. So the right will go to the right ventricle and the left to the left ventricles. But what's happening is we're getting this wave of depolarization to contract from the bottom of the heart up, right? If we just had it pause here and then caused it to contract in this wave, then our ventricles would essentially contract on top of themselves and not pump blood out. Instead, what we need them to do is to pump and squeeze from the bottom. And that's the role of these Purkinje fibers, is that they're able to transmit this wave of electrical depolarization and cause contraction in a very controlled bottom-up manner and allow blood to then be squeezed out of the ventricles and pass the pulmonary and aortic valves and then into circulation. So that's what we call an intrinsic control. Intrinsic meaning within the own cells, so that their cell types are going to determine it. We also have control, which we would call extrinsic. Extrinsic means some type of signal from outside the cardiomyocytes themselves. When we think about extrinsic, what we do is we look at parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Right? As we learned previously, parasympathetic is a decrease in the rate of heart in things. It paralyzes. So parasympathetic is there to cause a lowering or decreasing of the heart rate, and sympathetic is going to increase heart rate, which makes sense. We then have our endocrine glands. Epinephrine from adrenal are going to then be responsible for this. One thing that the book talks about that I'll just highlight is bradycardia, which is a slow heart rate that's often training induced. Indeed, as you might guess based on the definitions here, bradycardia is induced due to an increase in parasympathetic nervous system and is driving then a lower heart rate at rest. So last but not least, we'll take a look at where these extrinsic pathways exist. And of course, it makes sense. So first, our signals are going to be coming from our cerebrum, which we talked about earlier. And as you might imagine, where could we have different sensors? Well, one, of course, is the SA node. Right? That's the very obvious situation so that we can alter heart rate by increasing or decreasing the autorhythmicity of the SA node. We also have sympathetic nerve stimulation of the AV node and also on the ventricles. Right? These are going to have a lot of effect on heart rate, especially in the ventricles, but we're going to learn that this is going to be important in increasing the ability of the heart to contract and make it contract harder in later discussions. So in future lectures, we're also going to talk about that we have these sensory fibers that are also going to help regulate heart rate. We're going to talk about that in the next chapter or next unit that will really focus on that. But one other point I want to make is that ultimately heart rate is going to be determined by the balance between the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. And so ultimately your heart rate during rest or exercise is going to be balanced between how much parasympathetic and how much sympathetic you get, kind of like picturing it as a teeter-totter. And so that's how heart rate is ultimately controlled. We'll talk much more about that in future lectures. But that wraps up the control of heart rate.